Much. Well, good afternoon, good morning, everybody. We are going today to use the opportunity of the extreme winter which has impacted the northeast of the U.S. to talk more generally about winter storm risk in North America. So we've called this Boston's new big dig. How does U.S. winter storm risk impact your portfolio? So I'll be handing over in a moment to our two key speakers. They are Matt Nielsen, who's the Senior Director of Global Governmental and Regulatory Affairs at RMS, who himself has got a very strong meteorological background. And also, first you'll be hearing from Jeff Waters, who's a Manager of Model Product Strategy, who's going to be giving us some background around what has been happening in the last two winters. So in terms of the agenda for today, you'll hear, as I say, from Jeff Waters first on the last two winters, and then Matt will give some context to this in terms of our modeling of winter storm risk. Now we want your questions, so as you'll find that actually there's a WebEx chat feature in which you can ask questions, and we should have time at the end of this session. We have a full hour, but we should have at least 10 or 15 minutes for questions at the end. And if we don't answer them in the course of this presentation, then they will be answered afterwards via email. So I will now hand over. I think you'll see a picture of the three presenters today, and then I'll hand over to Jeff to take us through what has been happening. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Robert. So good morning, everyone. Happy to be here. My name is Jeff Waters. So let's begin by taking a look back at the last couple of winter seasons in the United States. So just at a glance, starting with the 2013-2014 season, we saw about 13 PCS, or Property Claim Services events. These are events that caused at least $25 million in insured losses. Of those events, there were about $2.3 billion in total insured losses caused during the 2013-2014 season, of which nearly 75% of that was caused by one event, the January 5th through 8th polar vortex events that impacted 17 states with a combination of blizzard conditions and frigid cold air. Looking ahead here into the 2014-2015 season, we've seen 8 PCS events so far, totaling about $2.2 billion in insured losses. And unlike the 2013-2014 season, this more recent season resulted in numerous snowfall and temperature records. For instance, Buffalo, New York, Cleveland, Ohio, and Chicago, Illinois recorded their coldest February on record. February was also the snowiest month on record for Boston, Massachusetts, as they received over nearly 65 inches of snow. And staying with Boston, they broke the all-time snowfall record this past winter, receiving over 118 inches of snow. That's almost 12 feet of snow. Now, just a quick point on the number of events you see here for the last couple of seasons. This is not representative of the total number of winter storm events that occurred. There are likely more that occurred but fell below that PCS loss threshold of $25 million. So those events that aren't recorded here still likely contributed in the aggregate to a material portion of overall winter storm average annual loss. And as far as the drivers or causes of damage over the last couple of years, we've seen a lot of evidence of roof collapses caused by heavy snow and ice loads, frozen pipes due to those cold air outbreaks, especially in the Midwest there in the Northeast, and of course business interruption caused by closed businesses and any kind of travel disruptions as a result of these winter events. Now, shifting your focus a little bit towards these images that you see here, what these images show are state temperature ranks. So it shows what the average winter temperature was from December through February over the last couple of seasons for each state, and where that ranks based on the 120-year history of temperature records. So looking first on the image to the left, you can see that, well, first of all, the blues denote colder than average temperatures, while reds and oranges denote above average temperatures. So as you can see, the winter of 2013-2014 was one of the top 10 coldest winters in parts of the Midwest and Great Lakes regions, but it was also the warmest winter on record for California. And similarly, this past winter ranks as one of the top 25 coldest winters throughout much of the Ohio Valley and Northeast, but it was also one of the warmest winters, in fact, the warmest winter on record for 5 states in the West. So now that we talked a bit about the last couple of seasons, let's talk a bit more about why they've been so active. So starting with the December 2013 through March 2014 time period, we noticed that there were neutral ENSO or El Nino Southern Oscillation conditions in the tropical Pacific, and likely other atmospheric patterns such as the North Atlantic Oscillation or Arctic Oscillation that help make parts of the Northern Hemisphere, including the United States, much more susceptible to stagnant general circulation patterns. And what that did is it created atmospheric ridges or peaks in the jet stream on either side of the United States and a deep valley or trough in between. And as a result, the jet stream dipped into the central and eastern parts of the United States and remained there for most of the winter, allowing for prolonged periods of Arctic air to move in and settle into the region from the north. And that's pretty much what this image here shows. It shows where the jet stream was located relative to normal from December 2013 through March 2014. So in the image, the greens, yellows, and oranges denote and are associated with warmer temperatures, while the blues, pinks, and purples were associated with colder temperatures. So as you can see, with that jet stream shifted so far south during the 2014 winter, a lot of that colder Arctic air and those areas covered there in purple and pink experienced the coldest weather of the season. So that's why you saw in the previous slide the states like Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan experience some of the coldest or top 10 coldest winters on record. Now, although it's not shown here, it was a very similar story for this past winter, except the jet stream was shifted a little further east and a little further north and didn't quite set into place until the January-February time period. So instead of the coldest temperatures being in the upper Midwest, they were more in the Great Lakes and Northeast, especially during the January-February time period. And one thing you might also be wondering is, what does the polar vortex have to do with any of this? So first, let's talk about what the polar vortex is. It's not a storm, but it's a region of Arctic air that rotates around the poles, trapping and containing a lot of this frigid air in its circulation. Now, this cold air that we just talked about is separated from the warmer air to the south of it via the polar jet stream, which is that pink line on the image here to the right. Now, the location of the polar vortex depends on the strength and position of the polar jet stream and the Arctic winds themselves. And like during the winter periods when the jet is weaker and especially when the jet is weaker and the winds are slower, parts of that vortex will break off and move southward with the jet stream, bringing with it very below average temperatures and very stormy conditions. And that's pretty much what we saw over the last couple of winter seasons in the United States. The jet stream was relatively weak and positioned much further south than normal, and was also quite wavy. So it resembled a lot of the image here you see on the left compared to the right. And with that jet stream remaining relatively stationary, it allowed wave after wave of Arctic air to move into that region, thereby reinforcing the waviness here of that polar jet stream. So now that we've talked a bit about the science and the meteorology behind these last couple of seasons, I'd now like to talk about how recent seasons have compared to those in the past. Now, the image here shows U.S. insured losses due to winter storms from the 1983 to 2015 time period where losses have been trended to 2015 U.S. dollars. The red line you see denotes the average annual loss as per our U.S. winter storm model here at RMS, and the black line denotes the running 5-year average since 1983. So upon first glance here, if you look more at the more recent seasons, you see that losses from recent seasons are pretty much in line with the long-term average annual winter storm losses as per our model. And although it's not shown here, the same can be said for return periods, where the return period of these last few seasons tends to be about 2 to 3 years. And similarly, realistic return periods are also evident at the state level. And again, it's not shown here, but in 2015, Massachusetts experienced one of the harshest winters in recent history with insured losses around $600 million. And that corresponding return period is about 56 years. So very realistic, given that it is, one of the harshest winters they've seen in recent memory in, say, the last 50 or 60 years. So quite realistic. Now, if you were to take what you see here over the most recent seasons and kind of compare that to what you've seen, what we can see over the last few decades, you can see that there were much higher losses during parts of the 1980s and 1990s, and also a lull in some of the winter storm activity and losses during the 2000s. So one thing to think about as we walk through the rest of this webinar today and get into the discussion is, were winters more extreme then, or is the industry better prepared today to manage, mitigate, and quantify winter storm risk compared to the past? And going one step further now with these recent seasons, I'd like to talk about how the events of these recent seasons compare to some of those in the past. Now, the chart here shows insured losses for select historical events from 1983 to 2015, again, trended to 2015 US dollars. And then that little table to the right shows what the corresponding return period is. So as you can see, recent events like the 2014 polar vortex event and the most significant event of this past winter, which is the February 16 to 22nd event, although they caused material insured losses and have realistic return periods of, say, 4 to 5 years, they could have been much worse, comparing them to some of these events you see here on the chart. For instance, the 1983 freeze outbreak consisted of 3 major waves of cold Arctic air that lasted nearly 2 weeks and impacted more than 40 states. And similarly, the 1993 storm of the century, for instance, caused widespread damage from the Gulf Coast to the Canadian Maritimes, in addition to record snowfalls across the Appalachian Mountains and a lot of the metro regions in the Northeast, so Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, New York City, and Boston, as well as hurricane-force wind speeds and extremely cold temperatures. So although we've seen some pretty significant events in the last couple of years, and a lot of those events have received a lot of attention and focus from the media and academia, as well as the insurance industry, they could have been much worse. And one thing you might want to wonder is, and ask yourself is, have we seen the worst of some of these winter storm events, or are there particular events that have not occurred yet that could still occur soon and cause a significant amount of losses? So with that, I'd like to turn it over now to Matt Nielsen to talk more about U.S. and Canada winter storm risk in general.
Thank you very much, Jeff. So what I'd like to do is actually do 3 things in the next few minutes. First, talk a bit about risk in the U.S. and Canada by the numbers, which is what you'll see on this slide. Then I'd like to talk a bit more about some of the unique aspects of modeling winter storms for the U.S. and Canada, and then talk about what's ahead and what those folks who are managing winter storm risk need to be thinking about in terms of what happens to winter storms under changing climate conditions. So starting here with sort of the overview of winter storm risk, I have some of the numbers here on the slide in terms of the average annual loss in the U.S. and in Canada. Now for the U.S., the number is about $2.3 billion, as Jeff showed on the previous chart, and that's comparable to other perils such as earthquake and flood. Now in Canada, it's about $400 million, and that makes it basically tied for the top peril across that country with severe convective storm. So that certainly is one of the more dominant perils that we see across that region. Now, when we look at some of the events that have occurred in the last, say, 15 to 20 years, since 2000, we've seen over $21 billion of insured losses from winter storms. And that actually makes it about the 3rd highest cumulative loss that we've seen from a particular peril, just behind hurricane and severe convective storm. So this certainly is a meaningful peril that has been causing loss over the last decade or 2. Now, one of the things that I like to draw folks' attention to is sort of the nature of winter storm risk in itself and how that plays through the insurance industry. So for example, you tend to have kind of a mix in terms of the types of events that you would experience, from very small events that happen very frequently to some large, more tail-like events, such as some of those that we've seen over the past 2 winters. So the issue here with winter storm events and trying to manage those is that you end up having, on one end of the spectrum, what I like to call sort of death by 1,000 paper cuts, where you have many, many frequent small events that sort of eat at your bottom line through the course of a year. But then you can also have some very large, severe events, and I'll talk about what some of those potential events might be, some of the ones that we haven't seen yet. But ultimately what we find is that for primary insurers, most of this risk is retained by those insurance companies writing it directly. And therefore, this is something that, where it may not always be thought of as a solvency risk, is something that is hitting profits, is hitting the bottom lines, and hitting your margins every year. One of the other things that I like to typically talk about with winter storm risk is how folks manage this in their own companies, and how what tends to happen is winter storm risk and severe convective storm risk are sort of lumped together and thought of as attritional risk. And I think that there needs to be somewhat of an awareness of the fact that if you're just using a severe convective storm model, you're not capturing the other parts of risk that are coming from winter storms, from the perils of snow, ice, wind, and freeze. And so it's important to look at both of those in combination, both of those side by side, since we do realize that that's how most folks in the insurance industry think about these perils. They think of these as, again, attritional winter storm, attritional weather risk. So that's one thing that I definitely like to bring up when having conversations about winter storm. So if we move to the next slide, I'll show a little bit more about the types of winter storms that we see across the U.S. and Canada, because it's not all about the Northeast. In fact, what we tend to see is that while there is a peak of risk and exposure in the Northeast, as you can see by this loss cost map that's sort of underlying some of these other storm tracks, you also have a peak in the Pacific Northwest. And the perils that you see across these different areas vary because of the different types of meteorology and topography involved. Now, if you look at the Pacific Northwest, for example, you'll see some of the dominant perils are snow, wind, and freeze. These tend to be more of the strong low-pressure systems that come down from the Gulf of Alaska or the Aleutian lows. And you can look back to, say, the 1960s and see some of the more major storms that have occurred, like I believe there's one in the 1960s called the Storm King that actually produced wind speeds in excess of 120 to 130 miles per hour in parts of the Cascades in Washington and Oregon. So very powerful windstorms that can occur. And even parts of Northern California, even though those of us in California this year are experiencing one of the worst droughts in history, we did have a PCS designated event back in December that caused over $100 million of insured loss from wind, flooding, and heavy snowfall. Now, across the southern states, we see snow, freeze, and ice. This is sort of the intersection of an area that has seen a large boom in population and building characteristics that don't necessarily lend themselves to being strong against some of these perils. So they're not as prepared as other parts of the country. And that intersecting with the fact that you tend to get, during years like this, very cold air intrusion to areas in the far south, areas across northern Texas, Dallas-Fort Worth, for example. And you can have snow, freeze outbreaks, and ice storms in areas of Oklahoma, Arkansas, and some of the other states in that region. So that definitely can lead to sort of being caught by surprise in some of these areas. And in fact, if you looked at that chart that Jeff showed earlier with some of the top events, 1983, that freeze event caused a significant amount of damage due to primarily damage coming from the state of Texas. You had very cold air sitting over that area for several weeks. And as a result, there was a lot of damage to agriculture as well as the fishing industry with a massive die-off of fish in Galveston Bay. Across the northern tier through the prairie provinces of Canada and the northern part of the United States, this is where you get Alberta clipper storms that move through that can bring heavy amounts of snow and also very cold air behind them with high winds. And then as you start moving towards the east, you'll see lake effect snowstorms that occur around the Great Lakes in the U.S. and Canada, where you have cold air that moves over the lakes before they've frozen, and that can cause intense snowfall, like what we've seen in areas of Buffalo and upstate New York the past couple seasons, where you can get feet on the order of a couple hours to a day or two. And then finally, in the Northeast, this is where we get the nor'easter storms, which can be very intense. These low-pressure systems that move up the East Coast, they ride along the Gulf Stream, and they tend to intensify, bring large amounts of snow, wind, ice, all of the different perils that accompany winter storms. So if we move on to the next slide, we'll talk about all of the individual perils themselves and what role they play in the risk in the U.S. and Canada. So here we have pie charts that represent the average annual loss and the 100 and 250-year contributions of each of the 4 different sub-perils. So one thing to keep in mind is that as you go to these different regions in the U.S., as we've showed in the previous slides, and different regions of Canada, the peril that dominates is going to change. But if you wrap all of those regions together, what you find is that in the U.S., freeze is really the dominant peril. And that has to do with the intersection, again, of high exposure in very vulnerable areas and duration of the freeze peril itself. As I mentioned, that 1983 freeze event lasted about 2 weeks. So there were areas in North Texas that didn't get above freezing for more than a week, which for that area is completely unprepared. So you have a lot of areas in the freeze-prone regions of the U.S. which are not prepared to deal with that type of weather that have also seen some pretty large increases in exposure in the last couple of decades. Now, if you look on the left-hand side here, I've noted some of the drivers of damage for the different sub-perils. So for freeze, what you typically tend to find is for both commercial and single-family residential, pipe burst tends to be a pretty large contributor to loss. You have the temperature differential, ice can form in the pipes, and it expands and causes the pipes to break, and then you have water intrusion and water damage. But then you also do get large losses to agriculture and business interruption. And in that 1983 freeze event, as I mentioned before, we did see agricultural losses across Texas as well as in areas of Florida where there was a large die-off of the citrus crops. When we move on to snow, Jeff mentioned earlier roof collapse. We've seen that a lot in the last few years. But one of the other mechanisms which may not be as obvious is something called ice damming, where for those areas that tend to have snow sort of sit and last on rooftops much longer, what tends to happen is that as you build a snowpack on top of that roof, sometimes the heat from the attic rises in and starts to melt that bottom layer of snow that's in direct contact with the roof. And as that liquid water starts running towards the edge of the roof, it'll refreeze and actually create a dam. And then you have this pool of water just sitting on top of your roof, and that water sometimes will intrude into the attic and cause damage. So that's, in essence, ice damming. And we tend to see that more in the northern states where you tend to have that more persistent snow sitting on those rooftops. For ice, we tend to see tree fall be a major player in damage because you'll get ice accumulating on branches. That creates a very heavy weight at the end of those branches and causes them to snap. A lot of times they'll fall into roofs or onto cars. You can also have pretty prolonged power outages, as we saw in the 1998 ice storm in Canada, where you had ice essentially accumulating for 5 to 6 days, and that caused some pretty severe power outage delays and severe losses. And in fact, in that particular event, some of the things that we capture in our model that have changed in the industry have to do with that particular event and how people are trying to mitigate against some of these major ice storms. For example, in 1998 for single-family dwellings and residences, we saw that there was an abnormally large proportion of that loss coming from freezer contents. And the sort of rumor goes that most folks were actually claiming that they had filet mignon and lobster in their freezer and therefore getting large paybacks in their claims. So the insurance industry has learned from that event and now has separate freezer endorsements, freezer contents endorsements. And also there have been some redundancies placed into the power grid. So at that time there was sort of one major transmission line going in and out of Montreal. That has since been essentially duplicated so that this type of event won't quite be as severe as it was at the time. So I believe our model would say that if this event were to occur today, it would be sort of in the $2 to $3 billion range, whereas at the time, if you inflate that to today's figures, it's much higher, more $3 to $4 billion. Now, if we look at the next set of pie charts, these are for Canada. You'll see a bit of a different distribution for peril types. Here you see, again, ice dominating. We talked about the 98 ice storm. the ice tends to dominate across AAL and all of the other high return periods. And this has to do with a couple of different factors, one of those being the fact that you have unique topography in Canada, particularly in the St. Lawrence River Valley, where you have a lot of exposure in cities like Montreal, Quebec City, even Ottawa. And this topography can play a role in setting up for very cold air at the surface and perhaps not quite frozen air on top of that, and is much more likely to create ice storms. And that intersection of that mechanism and that high exposure causes ice to be a much more dominant player across that country. Also the fact that the building codes for snow loads and freezing temperatures are much better than they are in parts of the U.S. due to the fact that they're just used to being able to withstand and endure those very cold temperatures and winter storms throughout that country. So therefore, they're not as high contributors across that region. So if we go into the next slide, I want to just take a moment to talk a little bit about some of the ingenuity that we need to use in order to model a peril like a winter storm. So I think right out of the gate, it's an interesting type of weather phenomenon because you can have 4 different modes of damage that occur from those different sub-perils. And the other interesting point here, too, is that you cannot, for some of these sub-perils, just use, for example, the hazard value to come up with a vulnerability. So one example of that, meaning you just can't use absolute temperature to tell you how vulnerable a building is going to be. Because there are different codes and different ways that buildings are constructed across the U.S. and Canada, that for areas that are used to cold temperatures, they're built differently and they're more prepared in some ways for winter storm events than, say, areas across the Sun Belt or southern part of the U.S. Therefore, we have to create indices for things like freeze and snow. For snow, it's a little bit easier because of the fact that the building community tends to look at roof loads and snow loads at the 25-year return period, so we can do something that's fairly similar. But for temperature and for freeze, the example I have here is looking at, what would negative 15 degrees Fahrenheit do in Dallas, Texas versus, say, New York City. So New York City, whereas it would be blisteringly cold, is much more prepared because of the infrastructure being mostly buried and hidden from the high cold exposure. In areas of Dallas, Texas, this would be fairly catastrophic because there's a lot of exposed piping. Insulation is not as good in some of these buildings, and they're just not prepared for it. So what we have to do is build an index so that we can relate the amount of damage we would expect in each city with the appropriate temperature for that climate. So this is our freeze index, and what we look at here is the departure from the 2-year January low temperature, departure from that mean, as a way of understanding when we would initiate risk. So this is definitely something that is a little bit unique to this particular peril, something we have to think a bit more about. Certainly there are other unique aspects of modeling, such as the fact that, as Jeff was talking about polar vortex earlier, we need to look at the global circulation and look at a much bigger picture to understand the types of winter storms and the frequency of winter storms that we might expect across North America. So from here, let's actually move and spend a couple minutes talking about where we think we're going with winter storm risk in the future. And one of the things that I hear, questions that I get more often these days is, well, given a warming climate, wouldn't we expect that winter storm risk is just going to disappear at some point, and we won't have to worry about it anymore? And I will say that, whereas we may end up seeing sort of a shortening of the wintertime season, so perhaps fewer days per year that we would expect snowfall or freezing temperatures and so forth, the severity of storms and severity of events may not necessarily dissipate. In fact, it may increase. So if we go back to our good old friend, the polar vortex, one of the reasons for this is that under a warming climate, what we may experience is a more frequent weakening of that polar vortex, therefore allowing more cold air intrusions to the areas of the south. And that could mean that you have more volatility and variability in winter storm risk. So in fact, that makes it even more necessary to ensure that you understand the types of events and the types of tail events that can be associated with these types of perils. So one of the interesting things is when looking at the polar vortex is the fact that, this is not just one local phenomenon that's only focused on North America. In fact, this spreads effects to different parts of the globe. So we've seen that there have been some of these cold air intrusions in areas across Europe. And in fact, there have been several studies done about how perhaps the severity of winter storms may increase across that continent. We've seen very severe storms occurring in areas such as Japan. So back in December, there was a very severe storm that had typhoon-strength winds, dumped over 6 feet of snow in areas of the mountains, and actually caused loss of life across the country. So that we definitely see that winter storms are not necessarily going away, that there is this sort of increasing intensity in some of these events. Part of that's due to just changes in the polar vortex itself, the weakening that we might expect. But the other component here also is that as you're warming up the globe, you're also inducing energy into the atmosphere. And what that does is for every 1 degree of temperature that you increase, you essentially get 4% more moisture that the atmosphere is able to hold. So there's more moisture in the atmosphere that's available for creating things like snow, for example. So anywhere that you see this sort of south to north moisture transport, such as areas off of the East Coast where you have the Gulf Stream, or areas off of Asia, such as the Kuroshio Current that comes up towards Japan, what will happen is that you can get more energy that can be induced into some of these storms to create more and heavier snowfall. And I think this year could be very symptomatic of that type of event for areas in Boston, for example. So I think it's definitely something worth understanding, and winter storm risk is not going to dissipate in the future. In fact, it becomes potentially more volatile and creates an even stronger need for understanding that risk going forward. So from here, I'm going to go ahead and pass it back to Jeff Waters, and we'll go ahead and open up to some questions from the audience.